This is something that's been on my mind for quite some time, but I figure now is just as good of a time to talk about it as any. So I know quite a few people who watch the television show The Walking Dead. As it may be a little evident from the title of this video, I am not actually a fan of zombies. Not so much the zombies themselves, but rather the entire zombie genre. To the point where I don't see much point in watching The Walking Dead, or reading the comic book it is based on. Although I'd be lying if I said the fact that Robert Kirkman is writing the comic doesn't have anything to do with me delaying reading that, as I'm not a huge fan of his work. So anyway, The Walking Dead. I know people who watch it. People who, if I'm being honest, I didn't peg them as being fans of the stuff in the comic booky genre. So it's great that they are watching stuff that I didn't think was in their wheelhouse. But then when I'm listening to a podcast that's actually a few years old, one of the gentlemen in the podcast I listen to is explaining why he reads the Walking Dead comic book. His co-host explained that he doesn't like zombies, to which the fan of The Walking Dead said, "Oh, but it's not about the zombies, it's about the human relationships and the characters interacting and all of that stuff." To which I wanted to reply to this guy, isn't that what every zombie story is about? Me and my parents recently watched Night of the Living Dead for the first time a few weeks ago. I thought it was quite an innovative movie, and I feel it doesn't quite get the credit it deserves in completely inventing a genre from the ground up. Sure, we had movies like King of the Zombies, Revolt of the Zombies, and White Zombie, which existed decades before Night of the Living Dead, but those films were not about the hordes of flesh eaters that we know of as zombies. If we are thinking in those terms, it was Night of the Living Dead that went there first. So what's Night of the Living Dead about, you may ask? Well, the film starts right at the beginning of what pop culture knows all too well to be the beginning of the zombie outbreak. We follow a girl who barricades herself in a house with another guy, at which point we start seeing the story from his perspective. Soon, we find out there are other survivors in the house as well, and then the movie is about the conflict between the people in the house. Usually they are arguing about what the best technique for staying alive will be. The ghouls, as they are called in this movie, aren't even featured that much. Really, the movie is about the human relationships and the characters interacting and all that kind of stuff. Oh. Whether people realize it or not, a zombie story that isn't about the characters interacting and us seeing how they respond to a worldwide crisis would be a pretty boring movie. That's why I suspect that every zombie movie follows the same pattern. The apocalypse happens, and then we're seeing the slow breakdown of this little slice of society in the form of a few survivors. That's what The Walking Dead is doing, but on a much larger scale and in an ongoing format. Let me take this back to the Night of the Living Dead for a minute. I find it somewhat strange and maybe a little bit unfair that Night of the Living Dead is so innovative and ahead of its time, as I said. It is the film we have to thank for the birth of the zombie genre. And yet, after watching it, there is literally no reason to watch another zombie story, at least for me, because it has been there and done that. The problem I have with zombie stories is that they are far too limited in what they can do. If they stray too far from the Night of the Living Dead formula, then they will just not work. In the mid-2000s, Robert Kirkman, the man behind The Walking Dead, wrote a comic book miniseries for Marvel Comics, which kicked off several sequels. This was called Marvel Zombies. This story is different from the usual zombie story because the zombies were sentient and spoke with each other, and the story wasn't actually about the human survivors and their war against the zombies and the gradual breakdown of their society. I haven't read Marvel Zombies because I didn't see the appeal. It's like watching a movie where a bear eats a human. Even if the bear feels guilty about eating the human, it still isn't a very engaging story at all. So even though I am not a fan of zombie stories, even I can see that if a story tries to break from that tried and true pattern set forth by Night of the Living Dead, it's going to have problems. Of course, maybe I'm talking nonsense, since this story did have at least 3 sequels, so it must have been popular with some people. Now, you might be saying, okay, so maybe there is a certain pattern that zombie stories all follow. But you could say the same thing for superhero stories, right? And I guess, to a degree, you're right. Most superhero stories do follow the same kind of formula. A bad guy does something. The hero of the piece does something in response. They fight, Depending on how long the story is, the bad guy either gets away so they can fight again, or the hero triumphs and the bad guy is defeated. But you could really say that any story follows that pattern to a degree. I just described Die Hard and The Nightmare Before Christmas, if you think about it. Not to mention, superhero stories really are much more versatile in what they can do compared to zombie stories. You can have any number of villains and motivations for villains in superhero movies. The villain might be a sleazy scumbag like Lex Luthor from the Superman films, or there might be a grain of sympathy that we feel for the villain, despite the villainous ways, like Magneto from the X-Men movies. The villain might want something as small and basic as to find a cure for his daughter, like the Sandman from Spider-Man 3, or he might not entirely be in control of his actions, like the Lizard from The Amazing Spider-Man. The villain might not even have his motivations that we can entirely understand, like the Joker from The Dark Knight. The point is, there are any number of ways you can do a superhero story so that you're not doing the exact same story that's been done countless times before. But if you wanted to do a zombie story, what kind of story can you really do? You have zombies, and they are basically the same thing that you see in The Night of the Living Dead or The Walking Dead. Not much variety there, really. Now, there are some exceptions to this rule. A while back, I reviewed a comic book story called Zombie Reanimated. I actually really enjoyed it, almost entirely because it took everything that's been established about zombies in previous zombie stories and went in the other direction. Instead of being a story about the falling apart of a group of humans at the beginning of the apocalypse, it was set a few decades after the apocalypse. So immediately, the story had potential to go in places that it otherwise would not have if it had followed the pattern of Night of the Living Dead. Likewise, instead of all zombies being dead and brainless, this story showcased two intelligent zombies and showed what it means to be air quotes alive or dead. So yeah, I'm not saying a good story cannot be told if you stray away from the Romero formula established in Night of the Living Dead, but I do feel like most storytellers hit the nail on the head when they realized that they had to make their zombie stories exactly like Night of the Living Dead, or at least very similar. There's just not much more you can do with a zombie story, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is why I really have no reason to watch or read The Walking Dead. Now, if someone comes and tells me that it's not at all what I'm talking about here, I might give the first volume a try. But overall, it seems to me that it is something that I can safely skip.